One of the reasons that Marx's analysis of the proletariat was so powerful is that the proletariat's not a bunch of victims. The proletariats are strong. The proletariat is strong, right? They are the force for revolution and a force for overturning capitalism and ushering in a new socialist and then communist society because they control, basically because they are the producing class. They have that power and they can bring everything to the stop and they can do that work. And now it's like when in, say, the economies of the global north, when the majority of workers are servants, that doesn't seem like, on the one hand, yes, we can stop things, but that doesn't feel like we're producing a powerful future.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
I'm a professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for joining me. It's a huge privilege to speak with you. I'm a huge fan of your work and I have been for some time. What I wanted to talk about is with Sublation Media, the last month, we've been trying to look at crisis theory, and my own comfortable territory when it comes to crisis theory is the falling rate of profit. It's like this ghost that I see everywhere. And I wanted to branch out of that and try and think about this current crisis from the ground up and think about the different kinds of theories that are becoming more powerful on the left for making sense of our particular moment. And I've noticed that the neo-feudal thesis is one of the big ideas at the moment. So I wondered if you could kind of walk me through how you started to think about this idea that, which I very much relate to, this idea that capitalism is transitioning. It appears to be capitalism is changing. It's a dynamic system, but there's this tendency, perhaps among Marxists, to think that it's almost inevitably changing into something better. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Can you tell me how you came to this, if I've characterized that correctly, and how you came to think of capitalism as possibly transitioning into something worse?
Yeah, sure. First, I really appreciate your characterization because the way I think about neo-feudalism as something capitalism is doing to itself. It's part of capitalism's own dynamic. I think of it in terms of capital's self-reflexivization. We can come back to that, how it's turning in on itself. So it's not something happening to capitalism. It's capitalism's own dynamics leading in another direction. I got into this. It must have been, 2018, 2019, I think. And I from Mackenzie Wark. So Mackenzie Wark has a book, Capital is Dead. And she'd been running different lectures, or I'd seen lectures or social media posts or something like that, where she'd been talking about this for a while. And at first, I'm like, this is stupid. I just totally disagree. There's no way, capital is dead. What a stupid thing to think. I mean, I was really just just couldn't stomach it. And then it kept haunting me, like one of those sort of things that you immediately dismiss, but it keeps attaching in yourself to you, like some kind of thorn. Some kind of thorn or leech or a little piece of meat stuck in the tooth. And so I was just like, okay, what if I let go of my resistance for a minute and thought, take it seriously? What happens if I take this seriously? That capital is dead and because she always adds, and is becoming something worse. And I found it really opening. I found like it opened up my thinking and opened up my ability to, I think, make sense of tendencies in the present. So it was really Mackenzie work, and where we disagree is, she has this whole approach, like this whole theory of like vectoralism and a vectoral class, which I don't find that useful or helpful. And she also disagrees with my language of neofeudalism, like why go back to some old term, like that's not helpful. So I think that the diagnosis that capitalism is becoming something worse is something that we share, but how to describe the something worse, what to highlight in the something worse, is where there's a lot of a lot of debate right now. And so I think it's useful to talk about it as neo-feudalism. And I'll just give two more reasons why, because I know we'll keep going into this. One of the reasons is that the language of, oh my God, we're all serfs now, or tech lords, or the lords and serfs of the internet. This kind of language has been around for like 10 or 15 years. So there's something where the culture itself is coughing up this imaginary, this way of understanding new kinds of unfreedom. So that's the first primary reason for me. Like, unlike Mackenzie's vectoralism, like nobody goes around saying, oh, the vector, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's just like nobody. But people do talk about like, oh my God, we're all fucking serfs. Like, this is horrible. And so it seems like the language that people are using. And then the second thing, there's this right-wing commentator named Joel Kotkin, who has a book. I think it's called Neofeudalism or the New Feudalism or something like this. And he's been working the coming of neofeudalism. And I disagree with most of the meat of the analysis, right? Like the way he understands the clerisy as some kind of like it gives a lot more power to academia than academia has. His analysis is not an economically informed analysis, but it does seem to hit on some themes that are crucial. And so I found that really useful. And then, in fact, there are other people who are writing it, like some basic liberals looking at changes in jurisprudence, the privatization of law, and they come through this. So it's an interesting, neofeudalism is an interesting diagnosis, in part because people from radically different political orientations are kind of landing in the same place.
That's really interesting, because how I became interested in the neo-feudalism thesis was exactly this way. And you can say, someone like Joel Kotkin, I was reading his book and I was thinking, this is really descriptive and qualitative. But at the same time, you have to understand how something appears to understand what it is, right? And so I have no problem with analyses. And in fact, I think analyses of the appearance of things are very useful. And I came at it I just kept saying, as I was medieval, this is like feudalism. Our notions of subjectivity, for instance, appeared increasingly backward looking or regressive, or some sort of negative dialectic was happening. And that's how I got interested in it. And that sort of clues us in that maybe there is some kind of underlying economic shift happening. So I wondered, though, what is that underlying economic relation? Is it, because it's not just a metaphor. The metaphors are perhaps useful because there is something shifting, but how is it not simply qualitative? How is it not simply descriptive or metaphorical? What is the actual economic relation that may be coming into being that is different than capitalism?
So I think about this in a few different ways. So one way is to see a change in capital's laws of motion. So if we think that the laws of motion of capitalism basically are, the push for competition, profit maximization, and capital accumulation, where primarily these laws are supposed to generate improvements, they're supposed to lead to forms of efficiency, but they're supposed to be kind of productive. They're laws that are supposed to be productive and progressive. I think that capitalism's own laws of motion are coming into conflict with one another and turning into their opposite. So, and in some ways, Marx always knows that this happens under capitalism as well. So so production can become destruction. That's happening now, though, more and more. And so in some ways you could say like the quantity of is turned, like in a nice dialectical way, the changing quantity is becoming a changing quality. That the more that capitalism is a mode of destruction, a mode of production becomes a mode of destruction, it becomes something else. Another way of thinking about this is the big Silicon Valley players don't follow market rules, right? They don't make profits for years and years and years. They rely on venture capital and private equity. And so because of that, it's like, oh, they're not actually accumulating capital. They're accumulating investment, which they eke. And then you can go to something else, which is the fact that, and this has been happening for over 20 or 30 years now, most corporations are not reinvesting in production. They're building up their executive salaries and giving payouts to their stockholders, or they're accumulating, or they're just hoarding money. That hoarding is old school associated with what under the economy under feudalism, just like lords just sitting on wealth or eating it. Like you eat it or you sit on it. But the kind of feudal imaginary is not one of investment for the sake of improvement and productivity. And that's what we have right now. So I think this is, it hits on one of the ways that your interest in declining rate of profit is part of the story. So it's in addition to these, how these sort of these laws of capital's laws of motion are turning into their opposites and coming in conflict with each other. We could say, well, why is that happening? And here I accept the kind of Brenner analysis of secular stagnation, declining rate of profit. And so what happens is the capitalists as a class are turned to forms of politically driven upward redistribution of wealth, right? They are, in Brett Christopher's terms, like taking, not making. So they use the political apparatus to move wealth to themselves, but they're not using production or the productive apparatus to generate wealth. So it's like they, instead of like baking instead of a pie getting bigger and bigger, they just take a bigger and bigger slice of a shrinking pie.
Or even a slice of a pie that doesn't exist yet, in the case of giving people debt and so on. Do you see what was happening during the COVID-19 pandemic as part of this or a disruption of this? Because one of the things that I noticed was happening was right before there were lockdowns, if you look at the lobbying records, corporations were lobbying for bailouts. They weren't lobbying to get their workers to work. They were saying, oh, we need these enormous cash transfers. And it was a way of kind of doing what all capitalists want to do, which is to bypass the pesky production process and all of the risk that's entailed, and to immediately sort of pocket profit, or maybe even to pay off debts and so on. But of course, the pandemic was real, right? I wonder if you see that, if you've incorporated that into your thesis, and like someone like Fabio Vighi has done, or if how you view that situation.
Oh, I know Fabio. I didn't know he was doing that. I'm glad to hear about that. I'll look for that. So that's the first thing. Like, well, Fabio. So it's like yes and no. Like I don't think this is an immediate. I don't think looking at what I'm talking about as an immediate diagnosis. But I'm not trying to think about like what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm looking at the long-term repercussions of 30 years of neoliberalism, right? The evisceration of social safety nets. Like, so you say what capital has always done. Like, I wouldn't use that kind of formulation, because I think that there's a change in how capital and capitalists are acting. I don't think they're acting as, I don't think they're acting as economic entities that use production in order to generate a profit, which they then reinvest in order to expand. That I think capital is acting in a different way. I don't think capitalists have always and everywhere acting the same way. I don't think capitalism is eternal. And so that's the first thing. In the characterization of capitalism, I think it makes sense to try to think a little more specifically about how do capitalists act? Do they really want to just bypass, or do they want to bypass workers all the time, or do they want to use workers in order to generate profits? Right? They get their so there's that. But yeah, I mean, I think for sure, we saw contemporary corporations exploiting the pandemic in order just to fill their coffers, and it was a politically generated upward redistribution of wealth, straight up.
Right. So could you give me a bit more detail about the first part? You said that they're acting in different ways today. So could you give me some examples of some of the differences that you've seen in the last 30 years? I know that you've talked to Sublation in the past, and you talked about Uber drivers and that sort of thing. And I wrote a little bit about trucker protests and so on. And I wanted to get a sense of how you think some of the examples now of how capitalists are relating to workers and how that's maybe qualitatively or relationally different than the past.
Yeah. So what's so strange about the kind of gig economy is the way that the employer-employee relationship is fragmenting and separating, and you have this huge insertion of a whole sector of mediators who take a cut by introducing actors on a market. So the weird thing about Uber is what Uber is doing is just connecting drivers and riders. Like, it's not a company that owns a fleet of vehicles. It's a mediator that connects different, it connects riders to drivers. And we have a whole bunch of these, all these different kind of gig work platforms that connect people seeking to purchase a task and people searching for money in exchange for doing a task. So the weird thing is that in these things like, TaskRabbit, Uber, they're not the employers. They're just mediators coming in and breaking relations between workers and employers. That's different, right? That's not like, oh, hey, I want to, I've got a store of capital. I want to be an industrialist. So I'm going to, have a factory built and then, get people to work in my factory where I own the means of production and they work for me. No, it's like, it's reflexivized. It's removed. There's an insertion of mediation. So what's interesting then is this, and the reason I think of this as a kind of neo-feudalism is this continuation of a logic of separation, this constant forms of separation, but creating new dependencies that weren't visible before. So what happens now is like we always say, oh yeah, workers, we always talk about a labor market, but we don't think about exactly the way that access to that market that can create a new relation of dependency, not just on the market, but dependency on the people who will give you access to the market for a cost.
I'm getting ahead of myself because I had all these questions that I want to ask to sort of go through, okay, the new relations of production and how things are changing. But I'm very excited because I'm thinking about the implications of some of these things, because I think one of the more interesting aspects of the argument that you put forward in your previous discussion with us with Alfie Bown on sci-fi was you were talking about, and of course you've written about this, but you were talking about how it's not like the capitalist owns the means of production, as you've just said. You own the means of production, and they become a mediator. And you just think like, well, all you have to do then is cut out the middleman, but that's always been our task, isn't it? That's always been our task as workers.
I'm a little allergic to the language of always.
I know. Right? I realized it when it came out of my mouth.
Yeah. The weird thing is, the internet was sold to us as eliminating the middleman, right? Like, oh, it will be, you can do everything directly. Everyone can do whatever they want directly. But no, it actually was the opposite. It was the increased presence of more and more and more mediators at just every level, right? Like, and this is one of the reasons I think that the thinking of this as a kind of serfdom is we can't not produce for some of these mediators. We don't have a choice. Like, our everyday actions, our productive actions, our reproductive, as in like communicative actions, produce forms of income for these mediators. So they always take some kind of cut, whether or not they take it in the form of claim to ownership of our data, claim to ownership of our metadata or our traces, or just the little bits of the little fees and fines and permissions that they extract from us as rents. But we're in a position now as that where we cannot not but produce for the economic and financial benefit of these overlords. Right, that's the kind of weird serfdom right there, right? Everything we do, they actually kind of own.
On this language of always, that's actually one of the major criticisms of this thesis, that isn't this giving capitalism too much credit? Taking too seriously its own self-identification as, or its own myths, like that we are free buyers and sellers meeting in the marketplace, and this is gone, therefore we don't have capitalism anymore. Hasn't this always been the case? One example. Or hasn't it always been the case that middlemen try to insert themselves between the factory and, you've got your shops, and then you've got your advertising, and you've got your distribution channels, and everybody wants a cut. And the history of capitalism is kind of characterized by people trying to get into that distribution line somewhere between the object and the consumer.
Wait, what was say the first part of your question again? Because there was two parts. Can you say the first part again?
Sure. So there's people will say that it's giving it too much credit, giving capitalism too much credit.
Okay, yeah.
That this is just the way capitalism really works.
Let's look at that part first, and then the mediators part. So, we can think about how there's a difference between expropriation and exploitation, right? Expropriation is just taking, right? So that somebody takes my money. If there's a bully on my corner, and every day I walk by and he takes some of my money, that doesn't mean that is not a capitalist relation. That's a relation just a blanket expropriation. Now, if every day I go to work for him, and I don't know, let's say I'm making sandwiches, then that he's going to go sell in the neighborhood and he's going to pay me for that, that's a capitalist relation. One involves a wage and production, and the other one is just taking. So now, is it the case that capitalism has been intertwined with expropriation? Sure. But can we analytically recognize two different forms of the production and taking of a surplus? Yes. And if we don't say that, then we can't even think capitalism. If we think everything is expropriation, then we have no way to distinguish between just, bullies taking stuff and capitalist economic forms. Marx himself, of course, as you well know, makes these distinctions, right? He thinks, as he says sometimes, may just even being just the Vulgar Manifesto, like nothing's changed but the form, right? From between the master slave, the lord serf, and the bourgeois and the proletariat. There's always the taking of the proceeds of the productive labor of the laboring class, but the form of it changes. If we don't recognize the difference between exploitation and expropriation, we can't see that. And so I think and this is actually why in some ways, the debates around are Uber workers independent contractors or are they employees? That's really interesting, right? Like capitalism itself, its bourgeois legal structures are grappling with the meaning and the changes in labor. So at least the capitalist class doesn't think that everything is the same. Like they're arguing about it. And I think that's a good hint that something is changing.
Oh, that's really interesting. And also, if you look at people who are part of the gig economy, they will say things like, well, I don't want to work for somebody. Why would it be so great to be an employee? So in that sense, there's like, I don't know, I suppose you could say a progressive side to it in the way that the shift from the shift from feudalism to capitalism had a progressive side where, as a serf, you're no longer chained to the land. You're free to work for any capitalist that will take you, but you are not free to not do that. You still are stuck in this kind of relation.
Yeah, I mean, we have to always remember to be dialectical. It's not going to be like a one-sided, like something might appear as free. It might really be free. It might be free in one way and not free in another way. But I mean, the so-called free workers, and Marx often uses that expression in Capital, is really free because they are freed from their own means of subsistence.
Right. So now so we have all of these shifts. We have the gig economy, for example, is a big part of this. Do you see it extending in any other areas within capitalism?
I read something recently that I thought was compelling, which was how gigification is encompassing more and more parts of life. So it's not exact, and I sort of think about that just like with kind of academic work, like how many academics do podcasts and academics, like so much of ours, like when we write, it's not like we make a living, most of us as writers. So that's also a kind of gig. And then, you get paid for reviewing for some presses. Sometimes we get paid for giving talks. We get paid for, writing for some publications, not for others, but you kind of craft those over to help supplement what for many academics are increasingly bad position. And then you get all adjunct labor. That's a kind of gigification that's really, and then the way that there are new aggregators, like these education aggregators are trying to swoop up that kind of work. In housing, we see that some of these big banks have bought into real estate aggregators that purchase houses that they will then rent to people to let them buy to own. And so the person is not having like a direct relation just with their own mortgage company or even the mortgage company being owned by other mortgage companies, but is in this weird limbo where in fact they never have any relation either to a landlord or to their own or to like a bank through which they hold a mortgage, but there's these different layers of holding companies. So again, the insertion of intermediaries in which people are increasingly caught with no ability to escape. So I think you can see, so that's more of a consumption side example as opposed to a labor side. Would it be another example?
Yeah, universities are a really good example of this. I don't think you can find, like I had trouble finding any full-time positions even advertised in Canada. It's all piecework. Everything is piecework. It's amazing. But can we think about this? Are you sort of averse to the idea of thinking about this in terms of following it to its logical conclusions? Do you see this spreading? Is this could we viably transfer into a world that is entirely neo-feudal? I mean, at the moment, we have obviously a mix of things. Lots of people still exist in these typical kind of employer-employee relationships. But do you see this as something that's expanding, spreading, that could become the dominant form at some point, even in the far future?
I just reviewed Quinn Slobodian's Crack Up Capitalism for the LA Review of Books. And I thought that from my perspective, it was a great global example of neo-feudalizing tendencies. And what's so brilliant in Slobodian's book is his emphasis on zones. And there are apparently like over 5,000 different zones all over the world. And these zones are places where states have carved out of themselves territories that are not subject to their laws. And so we usually think of things like special economic zones, but then you have free ports, you have tax havens. These are like the few different kinds of names that I remember. There's the the basic idea of these zones is like it comes from actually the forms of commerce that were prevalent right in the late Middle Ages, early Mediterranean period, where storage ports and free ports across the Mediterranean coast would be places where that country would not, or that city would not apply its own laws, but the merchant would be able to have their own tiny mini territory where they would basically they would be sovereign. So it's this kind of carving up of sovereignty. You see this like what was his name? The Premier Boris Johnson. Just wanted to establish like 10 different free zone city or like free economic cities in the UK. There's some of these docklands areas in the city of London, much also the city of London itself, because it doesn't, the regular laws, the rest of the city don't apply to it. And then Trump had a number of these sort of economic empowerment zone. They've gone in Honduras. They're all over the Middle East. So this is one of the things. These zones are clear examples of parcellated sovereignty, which are crucial to understanding neo-feudalism. So we've spent most of the first part of the conversation on the economic aspects, but when it's crucial to the to my notion of neo-feudalism and to the kind of classic feudal notion is that feudalism merged the political and the economic, right? So unlike the bourgeois separation between the two, they're merged. And these zones that Sublation talks about are really great examples of this.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.